Okay, everybody, I'm delighted to say that I don't have to give Ulf's lecture for him. But it's a pleasure to present Ulf Gärdenfors, and he's going to talk to us about the Swedish LifeWatch and its analysis portal. And after this presentation, then we'll have another discussion session focused on this afternoon's speakers. So a few seconds, reorganise, and same procedure as this morning. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about LifeWatch, and in particular the Swedish implementation of that concept. And I will focus on what we call the analysis portal. I believe that LifeWatch can take a lot of advantage of citizen science, and maybe also that amateurs can make use of, in particular, this analysis portal. Even though, in principle, LifeWatch is constructed to help biodiversity research in a way. But I hope that it can be used more widely than so. So in essence, this is an electronic infrastructure where biodiversity data and also other environmental data can be freely and easily accessed, and where it also will be tools for exploring, analyzing and visualizing the data and the results. So getting all data freely accessible at one place, you may ask, well, doesn't GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility, already do that? So let me then start with just explaining the difference. The GBIF, they focus a lot of digitizing, in particular historic, that is museum data, from collections, and store that into a database, and as such, a very important work. While LifeWatch is focusing on harvesting that data and other data from other databases. So LifeWatch is not focusing on storing data, but rather harvesting from different databases, and including other kind of biodiversity data, including environmental data that can be of interest for analysis and exploring. So that means that LifeWatch is dependent on GBIF and other databases, but it doesn't replace it. Okay, this picture is just to illustrate that LifeWatch is actually much more than the analysis portal, which I will, after this soon, focus on. But actually, LifeWatch, the idea of LifeWatch is to make information available through web services. And a web service, that's something that makes computers to speak to each other. That means that by putting web services to a lot of databases, each of these databases can be explored directly by researchers or their machines, or at one harvest point, and it can be reduced in many ways, in many contexts. But I'm going to, in this talk, focus what can be done at this focal point called analysis portal. But before I dig into that, I'll just say that in Sweden, we are a consortium of a number of museums, a number of universities, also museums with, in particular, the Natural History Museum and the GBF node and the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute. The majority of the network is paid by the Swedish Research Council, Vetenskapsrådet, but also the Environmental Protection Agency and all the participating partners here as well. Okay, so a little bit, some words about this analysis portal. You see the address there, which is pretty straightforward. Just don't forget the S. So it's out there, but we are still developing things in it. But you can play around and look at it. So one way of showing what this is that you can select, for instance, species information from a number of databases and select environmental data, put that in a funnel or some place to filter or select what you want, explore the data, analyze it, and maybe plot it in various shapes and formats. So I will just give you a few teasers here to what can be done. It's developed in a way that you have the data access along this row, then you have possibility to select or filter what part of that data you want to use and how to combine it. You can do some basic statistics calculations, so far not very advanced, but still you can aggregate the data in some various ways. You can choose a format of output and then show your results as maps, tables, diagrams, reports, or you can download the whole thing to your machine if you want to continue to play with the data. So let's have a look at what happens at the species button there. You can see that currently there are a number of databases with close to 40 million entries, observations. Some of them are not available unless you're allowed to see them. So there are a few millions that are hidden unless you're not allowed. I mean, that's kind of sensitive data like golden eagle nesting places and things like that. But most of it is totally free. You don't need to log on, and it's just to play around and explore. Of course, the Artportalen in two versions, the old one and the new, which maybe Johan didn't say, it's still two versions that will merge over, during this year into one. But there are museum databases that we just have started to harvest. There will come much more data. This is the old red list database. We have a lot of fish databases, and there will come much more after a while. So, for instance, say you're a keen amateur. How could I use the analysis portal for finding things that I'm interested in? Well, you could easily search taxa, of course, by name, or if you have the taxonomic ID from our taxonomic database, which, if I have time, I will come back to. But you can here choose many taxa from various in various ways to explore them together. And you can choose a taxonomic group, or you can pick species that are dependent on a certain substrate, or etc. Or if you can choose an area, you can draw a polygon or choose predefined region location and download or explore what species are there. Or choose time sets or any combination of those. Very soon, or rather soon hopefully, we will add a possibility to choose species based on their traits. Life history, what their habitat preference, substrate preference, etc., etc. We have more or less the data, we have techniques, but we haven't implemented it yet, but that will improve. Once you have selected your taxa you want to explore, you can look at, well, explore in various ways, see if you can see patterns or make correlations with environmental factors, etc. And as I said, hopefully soon also traits, etc. Just to give you a simple example, say we are interested in Lepidoptera. You enter Lepidoptera here in search by taxon name. This case maybe want to know which species are found around Lund. Draw a polygon and ask what species have been reported in this area, which have been reported most times, etc. So you just can download a list to see. And this, you can see that Eglaeus urtica Nesselfjäril is the one that has been reported 361 times or something, etc. You get a long list, but that's one way of following what species are have been reported on in an area you're interested in. And that draws from all databases then. If you want to add environmental thing, you have the environmental data. The difference between environmental data and map lawyers is that here you can explore the values. It's like lawyers, but you can use the values in that sheath. For instance, to analyze, to make a correlation with observation. Map lawyers is just a map showing things of that. So here is map or environmental data from the Meteorological Hydrological Institute. That I must say, it's a shame that this picture, I did this 2 months ago or something. Since then, Meteorological Hydrological Institute has decided not to provide this service in feature services. So we have to resolve that in some way, because this is really added value to directly be able to correlate your species occurrence with climatic data. They have it, but yeah, that's something we have to work on. What still is there is data about forests from what is called in Swedish, KNN data, forest data. So you can, in this case, explore beech forest and see how that correlates with your species. Take some more examples. Here I show the map features, but just to plot the data the taxon you're interested on a map showing a feature is can be a way of creating hypotheses. playing around to see if you can see the patterns. So in this case, it's a bush cricket plotted on the time for the first frost in autumn. And it seems like that this species only occurs where the frost comes very late. Or you can plot it on soil types to see if there are seems to be any correlation with that kind of feature. What you cannot really do directly today, but you can do it indirectly, but it takes a bit more manual work, is to get see the phenology, what patterns the data can show there. This is data from Outportalen showing the arrival of black cap, and it seems that each decade it arrives earlier. So today it arrives 2 weeks earlier than it used to do 50 years ago. But that functionality will come as well, I mean, to illustrate it directly. You can also produce species richness heat maps, and that's also a way, of course, of exploring the general bias of the data. So here are all species in all databases plotted, and it's the number of species, not number of observations. In some way, it reflects what we expect about the species richness, but again, as a biologist, you can see there are biases. If you choose to look at dragonflies, you can easily see here we have a focus project, and here we have another focus project on dragonflies. But again, it's interesting to have it visualized. Longhorn beetles is an example where probably is rather well covered and probably reflects quite well the real species richness distribution of that group. You can also, if you rather choose species dependent on a certain in this case, a certain tree species or types. So here we've plotted species, the distribution, or actually the heat map, number of species per grid area that are believed dependent on old broadleaf forest, that's old ädellövskog in Swedish. Classified according to what specialists think they are adhered to, or etc. If you plot species that are dependent on aspen, you get another pattern. And here are species dependent on mountainous forest or highland forests. There are a number of, the scales are different here. It's a way of illustrating and exploring patterns. You maybe noticed that the grid scale was different in these two examples, and you can easily adjust you can enter whatever grid size you want. And that's, again, because the data in the databases are not grid-based. They are point-based, so you can then illustrate them in any size of the grid. Okay, so how could citizen scientists contribute to this infrastructure in a way? Well, the most obvious things that we have been discussing here most of the day is to submitting data in different ways, and in Sweden we have a tradition of this kind of non-structured ad hoc reporting. and most of the data into, in particular, Alptotalen is that more opportunistic kind of data. I think we have great possibilities to develop more like structured schemes, or also like targeted, well, project with a certain target. So we have good opportunity to use citizens more in that way. To validate the data, we already do, but that could also be elaborated quite a lot. Also help identification. Again, we have that possibility in Alptotalen, but it's not as elaborated, for instance, as we saw in iSpot earlier this morning. And I don't know whether citizens, how many that creates apps, but since LifeWatch provides all data in web services, it could easily be reused into various kinds of applications. Yes, have a look at my. Still have some time. Good. What we dream of and think of is the last thing here. To use good, skilled amateurs and also, well, researchers to assign traits to species. That is, to classify what kind of forests or tree is that species dependent on, what is the generation length, what is, etc., 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 and to store that in an open library. Because when we have spoken to researchers, they often say, we don't want to have pre-classified traits. We want to classify that ourselves so we know that what we do. But could we then store all those classifications in an open library that other could reuse and do better? Not better maybe, but complement. That would be something very interesting. I think that skilled amateurs could contribute here as well. Okay, that was short about the Swedish LifeWatch implementation of the concept of LifeWatch. And the concept of LifeWatch is actually European, started with the preparatory phase in 2008, was an EU-funded preparatory phase. There were a number of countries participating in that, and came out a construction plan, a reference model, etc., how it should be done. 21 countries have signed a memorandum of interest. We're interested in that. 9 countries, the one in orange type here, have declared ready to start if conditions are right. The aim here is to form a European consortium, research consortium. It hasn't taken place yet, but it's still still struggling with that. But meanwhile, we have continued we started to develop the concept. Belgium has now also started to do some developments. It's starting something on marine in Greece. We hope it comes. At last, a few words about the context of where Alptotalen and Swedish LifeWatch comes from in a way. As I said, LifeWatch is a consortium, but the Artdatabanken, or Swedish Species Information Center, is the kind of the coordinating leading part. So we are a governmental body totally devoted to species information of all kinds. And we try to be the spider in the net of bridge between various stakeholders in the society when it comes to species information. And here are some of the core issues that we are dealing with. Like we are producing the national red lists, update that every 5 years. And we try to analyze pressuring factors, preferences, etc., and also produce recommendations about measures and also which species should have recovery programs, etc. we are commissioned to report on species and habitat trends, species and habitats on the EU directives. We report that to EU on behalf of Sweden every 6 years. We work a lot with information in various ways. We also conduct the Swedish Taxonomy Initiative, which have been running for 12 years by now, which had the aim to really find and scientifically describe all multicellular species in Sweden. And one part of that is more popular science type of encyclopedia, called in English the Encyclopedia of Swedish Flora and Fauna. We aimed of more or less describe all species in that popular science way. Unfortunately, the government gave us a budget reduction last year and said that must focus on digital presentation. And that we love, but we don't love that we then didn't have money for continuing producing this. So, well, anyhow, that's one part of trying to be a center of species information of various kinds. And we do some research as well pertaining to these issues. Okay, to be able to run both our own databases at Artdatabanken and the network of infrastructure of LifeWatch, one needs a solid taxonomic backbone, taxonomic database. So that's what we have been developing for some years as well, trying to cover all multicellular species in Sweden. And we are almost there. We have a couple of employees working full-time of entering, correcting, etc. And that is really essential for having good quality of the names. I'm almost there. This is my last slide. If you want to know more, please visit our homepage, SwedishLifeWatch.se, and yeah, you will find much more information there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So a few questions before we move on to discussion.
Yeah, I wonder about the level of standardization between European countries. Will it be possible for me, for example, if I learn how to analyze with the Swedish LifeWatch system, to go into the Poland and do the same easily?
Yeah, hopefully so. But that depends in a way on the other countries. But there is kind of a reference model saying that we should use and present data in certain number of standards. And that will be the same because that's what has been decided, and we follow international recommendations. So when it comes to data format, etc., yes. When it comes to the application of clicking around, etc., let's see, because that here we have made that by our own mind, so to speak. So that depends. But I know that like Belgium, who is now following us, are looking very carefully to what we are doing. So hopefully it will be coherent.
One of the things I thought was really fascinating is the capture of the traits data in relation to the species. And I just was wondering, that's something that at a European scale, it would be really fascinating to see the variation in those species traits in different places. And I just wondered whether you think that is a realistic, exciting opportunity, or whether I'm in a dream world.
You really have a good point that there is a substantial variation over Europe of the traits. I mean, within what we call the same species. And that's very important to acknowledge. So you can't make a database of the traits of the species of Europe, because that wouldn't necessarily work in all parts of Europe. I said this is a kind of a dream, and I certainly would like to dream that we could do this on European level. Here I think that skilled citizens, skilled amateurs, beside researchers, could contribute to classify the traits. And yeah, so I really would like to see it happen.
So can we find a reference in that case to who is coming up with these estimates on life history traits? I mean,
I think that's important to note. Is this just kind of gut feeling, or is there really a scientific paper behind this that is cited? So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not there yet, but I think that's very important.
When will all the information in museums with the specimen be entered in the database?
That's a good question as well. It's two levels to that answer. One is the digitalization of the museum collections. I know the museums are working quite hard to digitalize the collections, but that is an enormous effort. And we actually, through this Swedish Taxonomy initiative, pay substantial amounts of money to museums to help them do this work. So that's the first stage, and what they also need to do is to put geographical references to that, which they not always have been very good at traditionally to do. And then the next step is to have a central database for all the museums where all this material is stored, and that will be faster because that's almost already in place, and that's those 20,000 records that were shown there is harvested from that central database. So most of the Swedish museums are working towards putting all their material there, but it will, well, those 20,000 will hopefully grow very fast when that museum project evolves over, well, a year or two. But before all collections are entered that will take some more years. But that's not only dependent on technology, also human efforts.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And now we move on to some discussion about all the different topics that have been taken up this afternoon. So if the speakers from this afternoon install themselves in the hot seat. We start with the public.
Kjell is surprising.
Tord.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Arco pointed out the potential of combining more systematic data and more opportunistic data in analysis. So I'm wondering, these points at which birds are counted during this bird surveys, do you have do the reports provide the coordinates of those points, which would be really good because it allows us to associate that position with the environmental conditions.
Yeah. There are three levels there. One is that in most of the old data, there is no record of the coordinates, and they are lost forever. They are within a 25 by 25 kilometer square. In the old scheme then, what has been sampled the last 15-20 years, more than half of them, even more, have the exact spot, as long as the person really has been there. With the new scheme, we tell people where to go, and more people use GPS, and I presume that more and more have actually go within 10 meters of that spot. But we don't record that exactly. We can only say with a high certainty, if they have found their way, they are within 200 meters of that spot. I think for birds, that inaccuracy is not a huge problem, because the way the landscape looks like in a mosaic type of landscape that we have in most areas, the birds will sit in a deciduous forest. It will be around a bit. So, but those are the three levels we have.
Okay, so are you planning on trying to make the reporters report their coordinates? Because, I mean, for example, this environmental data like KNN, Sweden, the spatial resolution of the grid cells, they are 25 times 25 meters. And in some cases, I guess it can be of interest to really scale it down. So I think that such efforts would be great.
Yeah, we haven't done that so far. But if the right reason for doing it appears, and you can select species. I mean, normally people will count, let's say the average would be 300 birds along their 8 kilometers. And it's quite a job to ask them to have the exact position for each of those. It's just as, I mean, distance sampling is more or less impossible on a mission like this. So in that sense, I think the old scheme could be more directly used, because they have said, and that people are normally standing somewhere at the crossroad, or so they would really know where they have been.
But you have the counts for the corner points in this square, don't you?
Oh yes, yeah.
So
But they can
have the position.
Yeah, but they can still deviate 200 meters.
Yeah.
And but again, I don't think that's a huge problem with the birds, because most birds would move around in. It wouldn't mean too much exactly where you saw the bird, because they would explore quite a lot of the area around. So.
It's been really interesting today to hear about different approaches to citizen science, and in some cases the desire to take a more systematic approach, or to direct the volunteers in one way or another. And then also it was interesting to see with the Swedish LifeWatch the different analyses that you can do from the portal. And I was just wondering how much the panel consult with the volunteers as to what they would like to see, either in the way of analysis through the portal, or in the way of what they may be keen to do differently when they're out in the field.
Well, as I indicated in my talk, I think we could be much better there. We have the tradition more or less in Sweden to let people do what they want and report on that. But I'm convinced that we could do very much more there in providing citizens, keen citizens, with incentives, or just providing them a method like a scheme or similar to at least get certain share of all these people to report more structured. And I think we could take very much advantage of that.
So I guess I was thinking the other way up, in terms of what the citizens may wish, or the volunteers may wish to get from what you're doing, and whether or not the different visualizations, etc., that you have within the Swedish LifeWatch, are they things that the volunteers are wishing to see, or not?
Well, if I should continue then. Because the LifeWatch is officially a infrastructure for scientists, we have mainly focused in our workshops, because we have done We have done workshops at a number of universities and places and invited people to come. And we have mainly then focused on researchers and I would say people working with nature conservation, etc. To ask them what expectations do they have. But certainly it's a good idea to ask what others would, I mean, more normal, ordinary citizens would want to have. Although we can't push that too far, since it's the Swedish Research Council that pays it, and their focus is to provide an infrastructure that will help Swedish biodiversity research to be among the best in the world.
Just one reply. The Swedish Research Council is also a member of our organization, and they have the head, what do you call it, from the government. They had responsibility for popularization of science as well, and promotes dialogue between citizens and science. So
absolutely, and I agree with that effort and etc. What I meant was we can't change maybe the sites too much towards what citizen scientists want, even though what one could think of developing different portals in a way. That could be possible too.
As far as the Swedish bird survey goes, we have, I would say, very few suggestions of new questions to answer and so on. Why that is so, I don't know. Maybe it's because we already have a very fixed questions that we address. When we have suggestions for alternative ways of dealing with things, it's normally somebody who would say, I'm not really sure if your method is good, so I made it in another way. And here are the data, and I think these are better data. That happens now and then. But otherwise, as we said in the coffee break here, if we have 500 persons, there will be 500 reasons why they are there. And actually, quite few of them may actually have really the research interest to find out specific things. They are happy to be there and contribute and have a good reason to be out. And I don't know, but we don't hear that many suggestions, no.
As far as the Swedish butterfly monitoring is concerned, I know that quite a few people have a wish to be able to relate their own records to whether their particular site was experiencing a good year or a bad year. And I know that, for example, the French monitoring scheme has ways of visualizing that. We haven't come so far yet, but what we try to do is to produce regional trends, and so that they can see how things go in their province, for example. But I think in the long run it would be really very much appreciated if we could deliver some way of finding out what the trends would be on a site basis. And another thing that relates a little bit to the LifeWatch question is that it might be interesting to open up the way that people outside LifeWatch could submit or open up on databases so that they could be analyzed using LifeWatch or Swedish LifeWatch. So if you simplify or tell people how they should structure the web service so that they could link up their database, if they have one, to Swedish LifeWatch, then they could use all the facilities that you have, all the tools. And that could probably be quite useful as well.
I'm going to just take the chance to steer a little bit and I'll pick up on one of the questions that Helen delivered earlier on, as something we could maybe discuss now, and it builds directly on what you were talking about. How can one better initiate projects that are actually initiated jointly between amateurs and professional scientists? How can one actually identify areas where you can do something together from the start?
So yeah, and I guess both of my points are coming from the fact of perhaps feeling a little bit guilty as a scientist in terms of the numbers of assumptions that I make about the volunteer community, and also a little bit guilty about how much I take from the volunteer community and whether actually I give back. What do I give back? And so it's this sort of, yeah, it's just that fascination with that two-way interchange and also that desire to do the right thing.
Do you have any suggestions about it?
Well, I think, I mean, on the big bumblebee discovery that we're going to be running this summer, we're going to be inviting participants to pose questions that we can look at the data to answer. And of course, we might get a deluge of questions, or we might get no questions at all. And it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. But Michael Pocock, who's running the project with me, and I and the British Science Association are really keen to see whether we can answer a question overnight, for instance, and come up with some answers. So it's just a first step. But yeah, I think I'm really interested to hear what ideas other people have for becoming more co-creative, if you like.
Right. I can just give an example that, I mean, meeting with your volunteers is of course what we do, and we do that in different ways. We had a question coming up last winter about the deciduous trees in Sweden, and it became a little thread of discussion and developed into a question that we actually materialized this winter. So this winter, a couple of volunteers made an actual experiment about winter dormancy in deciduous trees. So we can, and it's fun to do that. But I would agree with Åke still that it's pretty rare to get questions. I mean, it's going to be about also talking about the process of developing a hypothesis, testable hypothesis. Yeah.
But I do wonder whether there's something about the scientific process that limits people people don't have the confidence to ask the questions. And if you go into a primary school, they will ask you a lot of questions, a lot of wild questions, which are just fantastic. And then as we get older, we seem to be really limited by our exchange with scientists. And there does seem to be this sort of hierarchical thing that develops. And so I guess it's partly beginning to dissolve that a little bit. And then that's when I worry about, if we say you have to be more systematic and follow the scientific protocol, whether we lose some of that freedom that people are beginning to develop a little.
I guess it's also, it's a sort of, it's not just in citizen science, it's a general symptom, if talking about climate change or something like that, that somehow there's something in the education system that isn't informing the public about things like probability and sampling. And if it's a completely foreign language, then obviously we're going to have difficulty communicating. So I think there are some fundamental problems in communication about science.
That's why the dialogue is so important, and we need to work on that, because we need to listen and talk with each other.
At the Open University, we have a platform called Enquire, N-Q-U-I-R-E, which is still in development, but basically it's meant to encourage inquiry learning, so that people actually learn through using the scientific method on questions that they may generate themselves, or might come from a teacher or an undergraduate class. And the projects I mentioned in iSpot are going to link to that. So I was the one, I think, who posed that question of how do we get the public to help us define the questions. And it'll be interesting to see how well this works. Inquiry is not my project, so I don't know how what lies behind it. But inquiry learning is a well articulated method of teaching all kinds of things, not just science. So I think it'll be interesting. It will develop somewhere. It may not be our project, but it might be. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think we'll see more and more citizen science originated inquiries. I mean, it's already happening. I mean, there's the maker movement, quite outside biology. There's the maker movement, where people are getting together in fairs and swapping bits of hardware and electronics and making stuff. There's this sort of garage molecular biology. There's all sorts of things going on. And I see no reason why it shouldn't happen in our field as well.
I have two questions about data security and use. I think many scientists have in their computer some useful data, but perhaps they hesitate to put it on this media because then it will be available to everybody. And perhaps they want to have some say about what should be used to. So I think that those how secure oil data, how many different geographic places do we have all the data? And is it possible for scientists to put in some databases that are not freely available but can be used if the scientists think it's okay for this purpose, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could both technically and in fact provide a database where you need to log on to be able to see. I mean, we have already had discussions with the Swedish vet administration, SVR. They have data, a lot of data that they, by law, can't show. But still, those who would like to make research of that data would really like to have it in the LifeWatch infrastructure to be able to use the tools and to be able to maybe co-analyze with other data. So that would be absolutely possible. Another way is for instance, in the new version of Multipotalen that's partly launched, you can put a time limit on if you, for example, is a researcher and you don't want anybody to use and see your data for the next year or next 3 years, you can put a time limit on it, and after that it's shown. And I don't know technically if one could put a time limit forever. Well, one can hide it, so for anybody who is not logged on, yeah. So it's possible. Although, I mean, we try to emphasize people to publish as much as possible freely accessible.
I'm thinking also about environmental data, for example. Is it possible also to put it on this LifeWatch?
Yeah, there it's what we do is we harvest from web services that publish the data in the correct format, so to speak. So we are dependent on other institutes, departments that publishes it.
So there are no own databases?
No, I mean the whole concept of LifeWatch is not to have own databases, but to harvest, put together.
I think something we've got to...
The first part of my question was not answered, but how many separate geographic places do you have for the data for security?
Aha, I mean so.
Yeah.
Well, it's not that it's mirrored in Canada or somewhere, but that's maybe an idea that we should think of. But it's backupped very frequently in different computers. But when you say they are, I think, all in Uppsala.
Yeah. That's the problem.
So if there is a bomb on Uppsala, yeah, that's a problem. You're right, we maybe could think of mirroring it.
I think one point I'd just like to make is that increasingly now, we researchers, we're going to, before we publish, even if we're ecologists, we're going to be obliged to put our data on the database.
Yes.
So you're going to get access to, in the future, huge volumes of ecological species, environmental data, just in the same way that with GenBank, if you publish a sequence, it's got to be there in GenBank before the paper's accepted. So I think that
and that's
we're moving
I think very good
into a
process.
different era where actually, as paid people, researchers paid with public money, we don't have a right to say these are my data and I'm not going to let you look at them. So there's a new approach coming.
That's very good.
Yes, you had a question.
I wanted to comment on an earlier point we had that also Helen raised, how to involve people and if they want to be involved in asking questions and why they don't ask questions. And my experience from taking part in bird monitoring programs in different countries is that people are often just happy if they can go out and do something and kind of enjoy it, and they don't really want to think about it, and they don't want to ask questions because they just want to be out and enjoy it, and not because they do it in their free time. They just want to relax and do it. But what's important for them is that they know that the data are going to be used, and that there is some use of it, and not that they go out and collect data and they will just disappear and nothing's going to happen. That I think is very important to many people, even though they don't have a specific question themselves, but they want to know their effort that they do in their free time, even though they enjoy it, that will be used at some point. And for quite a number of people, it's also then at some point important when the data are used that they find their name in some list of acknowledgements, and that's something that we shouldn't maybe underestimate. I mean, of course, if you publish an article about data that are used from such a huge like Arco towns, or you can't list all 10,000 people, but you might be able to put such a list somewhere online. And then if someone really wants, you can just look up the name and just, oh yeah, my name's in there, and I've contributed to it. And I think that's maybe a way of giving something back.
Sorry. Just a comment. That function is already in LifeWatch, that you can get a list of who has contributed to the data that I selected. So if you want to, we would encourage people that do research on the data that somewhere acknowledge who contributed with the data.
Cool.
I have a question to Arco. Species distribution modeling is a really huge topic, research topic, and I have the impression that there are almost two parallel lines in the modeling there, in that there is a group of people advocating occupancy modeling a lot, while others are advocating machine learning techniques, for example, Maxent or generalized additive models or something, things like that. Can you reflect on this? Have you seen comparison between these different?
There's a growing amount of comparison. I think recently there was a paper where some people criticized the species distribution modeling where no detection probability was taken into account. And I think in the longer run, the machine learning people, Maxent, will be in the area of the losers. That's my feeling. So then they are forced to go into the taking into account detection. That's my feeling. In some way, the detection probability is too difficult for many people, and Maxent is very easy to use. Yeah, and from there, I would like to have another comment, because from the discussion we also here have. My feeling is that one of the bottlenecks is that researchers do underuse all these data. So I don't care too much about the observers and their motivation. I think the problem is more that it's difficult to convince researchers that this is good data, that you can use it, and you need to invest more in that. So I saw in your talk when you're saying that you have also report functions, etc. Well, that's fine, but I think even more convincing would be if you could build an infrastructure where you could help researchers doing the more sophisticated analysis or preparing the data in the form they need for occupancy modeling. That would really be a big step. In the Netherlands, we also have such a big system, and there are hardly any researchers that are using it, although it's advocated to use the data. Researchers, they step back and say, well, all sort of biases, I can't oversee what's going on in this. Okay, and then it's just what people do, it's just more or less for fun, if I say it more negative. So there's another challenge, I think. to think more, to think more how to convince researchers to exploit these data better.
Gabrielle.
May I go back to the question Helen raised about payback to the volunteers? Because I think people going out and monitoring and they see declines in populations. And I think what they want is the populations to rise again. They want restoration actions, management in the field. So I think that's the best payback we can do to many volunteers. And for that we need money, of course, and not the county administrative boards where I work. We don't have that much money, some, but not that much. So what you can do is to tell the SIPA, for example, that show them the declines, and you can do that from your databases to extract that data. And I think that's a good way to pay back to the volunteers, to see that yes, we can share with your data, and now we have shown it for the authorities, and hopefully they have money to put out in
One comment there. I think many conservation societies and societies in general have seen declining numbers, and people having time to commit themselves to societies. But I think that citizen science networks and people spending time and monitoring things and monitoring species and putting effort into doing that are very suitable for encouraging directed efforts for just like you can read about flash mobs where people they gather somewhere and do something, and I think citizen science networks provide excellent opportunities for that kind of directed focused efforts for saving some sites, and it doesn't have to be all that regular, but I think you can gather people quite easily and do things like that because they feel they have a common cause, but they couldn't commit all that time on a regular monthly basis or anything, but directed efforts may well be possible.
Sorry.
Yeah, another question to Arco. You said that counts of bird quantity counts, the number of birds were difficult to use if they were recorded from spontaneous records, so to speak. But I thought, isn't that a grid problem? If you have a very small, narrow grid for the records, there would be a convergence between counts and occupancy. Because if it is approaching the range of one individual or one pair, so wouldn't that work in the same way? Wouldn't that be a kind of quantitative measuring of spontaneous records also?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. but you can't make it too small, this grid, because then a bird is using a number of a bird doesn't stick to the side then.
I thought, for example, for many birds, 100 meters. For perhaps more resident small bug or so, 10 meters or so. If absence or presence there would be just one individual, so to speak.
Yeah.
One
Well,
individual is there or not there.
Well, if observers indeed collect coordinates of all individual observation per species, then it has a certain promise. Yeah, I agree.
Would be
But this is just one of the difficulties. The other one is the closure period, which also is for abundance is more difficult because closure means that the number of individuals may not change over the detection period, which means if some of these birds just fly away, then you run into trouble already. So there are more difficulties.
Yeah.
So you don't get this €500.
More and more.
probably we should stop while the going's good. It's been a really excellent discussion. Thank you everybody for participating. And so I'd like to end up by just thanking all today's speakers. It's been a really entertaining, informative day, so I'm extremely happy. Thank you.